Hi everybody, I'm Megan Hill. I'm with the Harvard Project and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Miriam Jorgensen. Miriam, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, Megan, it's great to see you. My name is Miriam Jorgensen, and I serve as Research Director for the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, and also for its sister organization, the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona.
Great, it's great to have you here today. So over the weekend, the Harvard Project and the Native Nations Institute released a really important policy brief that critiques the Treasury's first allocation of CARES Act relief funds to Indian country. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the policy brief, what was learned about how it was distributed, what formula the Treasury used.
Sure. So the policy brief that we released over the weekend really looks at the allocation of this first tranche or first round of distributions from the CARES Act, and basically says that the population numbers that were used for distributing those monies to try to figure out the proportion that would go to each tribe, those numbers were probably not the best numbers to be using. The brief looks at a variety of population and in fact, I even feel uncomfortable using the word population, but counts of American Indians living on reservation and tribal lands, and shows that using different counts gives rise to pretty different allocations of funds, and that the conclusion that we draw from that is that the choice of population count, and maybe population count is the best way of putting it, makes a big difference. So that's the big point of the brief, of choosing one or another different count of Native people who live on any reservation gives you pretty different numbers, and so therefore the count matters. So that's kind of the big conclusion. But the other thing that it really takes up is this issue of whether or not those counts of Native Americans living on reservations are even the right numbers to be using at all. Before the distributions were made to tribes, the Treasury asked each tribe to certify its enrolled number of citizens. And when you think about a tribal government, which is what the CARES Act was trying to think about, it was trying to think about how do we compensate tribal governments for their extraordinary expenses and economic losses from the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't usually think just about the number of people living in a geography. We think about the citizens of a nation. We think about the citizens that are under that jurisdiction of that tribal government. And so Treasury had tribes certify the number of enrolled members, the number of tribal citizens, and it turns out they didn't use that number at all. So that's the other big point, I think, of this policy brief, is to say, look, if you're going to make a distribution based on some kind of a population count, it doesn't make a lot of sense to use one of these data series that give rise to some fairly arbitrary and different numbers. It probably makes a lot more sense to use something that tribes have certified as a number that makes sense to them, which is their citizenship numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like from the brief, it indicates that HUD data was used on some of these population numbers. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on how, for example, a tribal nation with a large off-reservation population fared in this distribution. Are you able to make any of those kinds of conclusions?
So not very straightforwardly. So I do want to say one thing just before we dive into this portion of the discussion, which is, yes, we used numbers that were available from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and from the Indian Community Development Block Grant Program, or the Housing Block Grant Program that the Department of Housing and Urban Development uses. We make no comment about the appropriateness of the use of those data series for HUD's purposes. So this is not to critique or make any commentary on HUD's use of those numbers. There's a whole group of experts in that area, and that's their thing. We simply went to those population series that are available through HUD because that's what Treasury said they used. Right. So we went to those numbers and found a variety of population data series that were based on these various census counts of Native people living on reservations and tribal areas, and looked at the differences that using various ones of those data series would create when doing a distribution of CARES Act monies. So that's kind of my big caveat up front.
Yeah.
What we do find is that there are some strange anomalies in these data series, which probably make sense or were created for particular purposes for HUD and its distribution of monies, but don't really make a lot of sense when we're thinking about serving tribal governments under the CARES Act. So there are a number of tribes, not a lot, but a few, that are listed as having no population. There are other tribes that are listed as having very small on-reservation populations, yet we know from, say, their websites or other public documentation that they have relatively large numbers of citizens. So this gets to some of your point of, it is possible by using certain of the HUD series to disadvantage tribes that have very low on-reservation populations, either because they actually have no reservation per se, they have a very small reservation, or the majority of their citizens live outside the physical boundaries of that reservation. So it may disadvantage those tribes, yes. But there are other anomalies in the numbers that may also give rise to disadvantages, such as those tribes that seem to be listed only with 0 citizens, which again doesn't make any sense at all, or 0 population, I should say.
Right, right. So given the information that's sort of set forth in this brief, what do you think, or how do you think tribal governments or tribal leaders can use the information presented, particularly with the next distribution on the horizon?
Right, so the CARES Act indicates that there are sort of 3 purposes behind making sure that tribes receive some sort of support, some stimulus to help them make it through the pandemic. The first off is the distribution that's based on population. So that's what this first tranche of funds were about. The second and third reasons for distributing funds are going to be taken care of in a second round of distribution. And those are to do with the sort of the economic wherewithal of tribes. So one is to kind of think about what's the employment that they generate and the economic impact of an individual tribe in its region and area. And then also to think about what are the particular costs that are being borne by tribal governments to deal with COVID-19's health impacts. So thinking on a per person basis, on a per employee kind of basis, and on sort of a health impacts basis. So this first tranche of funds was really trying to think about that per person. And we think it kind of didn't choose the right data series to think about that because of the sort of arbitrary choices that were out there. It does mean that in this second round that of funds distributions, it can look at the second and third purposes around employment impacts and particularly health costs impacts and say, why not think about doing a little bit of makeup to do some smoothing over potentially some underpayments that could have been made in that first round. So I think one of the things that tribes should be thinking about is whether or not it makes sense for them to speak to the government about using this second round distribution to kind of potentially make up for some of those problems in the first round, to deal with the 2 big things that second round is supposed to do, and to kind of have this tack on of, is this a chance to kind of make things right again? Critically, we don't really want tribes to be seen as a chance to sort of fight over the pot of limited funds that are out there. We're not trying to kind of throw fat onto the fire. Instead, to point out that tribes were asked by Treasury to behave as tribes, which is tribal governments have citizens under their jurisdiction. Please tell us the number of citizens that are under your jurisdiction. Then the federal government turned around and basically said to tribes, oh, by the way, you're just distributors of services to a racial population, and kind of limiting tribes' capacity to behave as tribes in those choices of population counts that they used. So really the argument for tribes to be making is to go back to the federal government and say, you wanted us to behave as governments, you wanted us to behave as partners with you in combating COVID-19, and we can do that better by being treated as governments. And that means using our citizenship numbers, and then look at this second round distribution as a way to really take those citizenship numbers into account, make up for any under distributions that were made there, and then do the other pieces of work too.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's incredibly important. Um, Before we wrap up, any last thoughts or maybe any other key findings that came forth in the brief that we haven't covered?
No, but thanks for asking that. I really hope that folks look at that this brief and say uh, that this is a chance for tribal governments to remind the federal government of their government, the nature of of tribes being tribal governments, and to again not get caught up in intertribal conflict, because really the way forward is for tribes to be working together with partner governments at the local, state, and federal level to combat this crisis. Uh, and I'm hoping that others will also look to the Harvard Project and Native Nations Institute for future policy briefs for commentary that we might have to carry the policy discussions related to COVID-19 forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a long road ahead of us in Indian country, and this analysis and the work that you've been doing, Miriam, and the entire teams at the Harvard Project and NNI have been terrific. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Megan.